Democrats by themselves, even what the vice president couldn't come up with. There was a statement made by Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, yesterday, which is nothing short of amazing. At a press conference, he said of the filibuster, and I quote, "It has no racial history at all, none." Amazing that he would say that. If you go back and study the history of this body, John Caldwell Calhoun, senator from South Carolina, started in early parts of the 19th century of using this unlimited debate to protect slave states, to protect the interests of the southern states. And that progressed in history to the point where in modern times, at least in the 20th century, the filibuster was used consistently to stop federalizing the crime of lynching. I don't know who would argue in Kentucky or anywhere else that the crime of lynching has nothing to do with race. But the filibuster was used to protect federalizing that crime. And it was used in an effort to stop the bills that were trying to outlaw a poll tax. Poll tax, that meant you had to pay to be able to vote. It was used in the South to try and discourage African Americans from voting. It clearly was racial. And the filibuster was used over and over again to protect a vote on the Senate floor, this Senate floor, from taking place on the poll tax. Then fast forward several decades to the 1960s. Richard Russell of Georgia engineered, he was the architect, the legislative architect of the filibuster that stopped the civil rights bills in the 1960s. Certainly, Senator McConnell, who was working in the Senate at that time as an intern, if I'm not mistaken, must remember the filibuster being used against a civil rights bill. And to say that the filibuster has no racial history at all, none, is to ignore the obvious. Here's the point we're getting to. Senator Schumer has said it on the floor. Others have said it as well. We've got to be productive in this session of the Senate. After the last 4 years, we've seen the Senate really break down to the point where they weren't productive at all. We weren't productive at all. 29 amendment votes in the last year of Senator McConnell's reign as the Republican leader. 29 amendment votes in 1 year. Previous year under Senator McConnell, 22 amendment votes. No activity on the floor of the Senate. We can't let that happen. There are things that need to be done. And let me mention two. One of them that certainly needs to be done is to protect America's right to vote. The senator from South Dakota comes and says, well, we had this big turnout on November 3rd, 2020, and now the Democrats are meeting talking about changing the voting laws. Why would we want to change if we had such a big turnout? He ignores what happened in between. After the election returns of November 3rd, 2020, Republicans across the nation in 40 different states introduced hundreds of bills to limit people's right to vote. That's why we're responding with this federal response. It's now being considered in the Senate Rules Committee. He missed part of the equation. It went from November 3rd's big turnout to efforts in state legislatures to restrict turnout, to limit the rights of people to vote across America, especially African Americans and Latinos and those who are not wealthy, to limit their right to vote. And then came this response on the federal basis. That's an important point. And if we believed that the filibuster would not be used against it, if there was some promise that it wouldn't be, we certainly could bring that bill to the floor for debate, and we should, if we're given that kind of assurance. The final point I want to make is a hearing we held yesterday. It was a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee on guns and gun violence. I scheduled it last week, and I didn't know as I scheduled it the tragedy that was occurring in Atlanta, Georgia, with 8 people who were murdered. We heard about that. It was an outrage. These poor innocent people killed, coincidentally, majority of them Asian Americans, at a time when we know hate crimes against Asian Americans are on the rise. That was the day that I announced the hearing that occurred yesterday. But little did I know as we prepared 2 days ago for that hearing what would happen in Boulder, Colorado, just 2 days ago, when 10 innocent people were killed at a supermarket. We had a hearing yesterday. It was an important hearing. Members all attended. Sadly, one of the members on the other side came in, the junior senator from Texas, and characterized our hearing on gun violence in light of what's happening in America as ridiculous theater. Those were his words, ridiculous theater. There was nothing ridiculous about the hearing that we held yesterday. It was a matter of life and death, and the grief that is being felt in Boulder, Colorado, Atlanta, Georgia, and all over America is a grief that is shared on a daily basis. 40,000 Americans each year lose their lives to gun violence. 40,000, a record-breaking number and nothing we should be proud of as a nation. And when we address gun violence and the measures that should be taken to reduce it, it is not ridiculous, it is as serious as it gets. And furthermore, it's not theater. Theater is a depiction of reality. The Senate Judiciary Committee is reality. We are empowered as senators to change the laws of America and make it safer. That is not a theatrical performance. That is just discharging our duties as United States senators. So I would say to that senator and others, I agree completely with Senator Schumer. We need to bring bills to the floor that will reduce gun violence in America. Keep firearms out of the hands of people who should not have them. Convicted felons and mentally unstable people should not be having guns and buying them and able to kill innocent people who are just stopping by at the supermarket to pick up something to take home. That's what happened in Boulder, Colorado. And as the stories are printed in newspapers across America about those lives lost, it is a grim reminder that this is not ridiculous, it is not theater, it is a life and death issue which we have the power to change. I hope that we can bring this measure to the floor, the one that passed the House of Representatives and others, to bring sanity to our Second Amendment, to make sure that we have constitutional, common sense gun safety that is consistent with any constitutional right. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of calendar number 40, Rachel Leland Levine of Pennsylvania, to be an Assistant Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Rachel Leland Levine of Pennsylvania to be an Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy.